Hello everyone and welcome back to White1 Racing. Today we'll talk about clutches for Vespa Small. Since we've spoken on several occasions about those for the Vespa Large, today it's original clutches for the Vespa Small. So, we have two clutches here, one of the Vespa 50 that has always existed from the 3 gears one up to the ET3 Primavera. Here it is, and even on the PK up to the PK XL there was this clutch. Subsequently, this one of the Vespa 50 HP was produced, and it was a remarkable progress. A first modification that Piaggio made to remedy the problems of the previous clutch, always a bit hard and perhaps difficult to attack well, especially with short radius. We'll also talk about this. So we tightened the image to improve the recording of the operations and also of the details. So in the meantime, this here is the clutch of the old Vespa as it was at the beginning, and then this is from the HP. Now, both on the small and on the large ones, Piaggio made these change more or less in the same period, because the clutch of the Cosa 2 came out and that of the HP is more or less contemporary. And they try to, in both cases, both cases of making improvements. So in the meantime, let's disassemble. They're both mounted with springs, and this is the old one. The difference, the most important difference between the two, is that the old one has only one spring, while the new one has 6 springs. The load of which, now the ones we have here surely are the reinforced ones. See this here? The original ones are still thinner coils. However, the load of the 6 springs is lower than that of the single spring. Yet this new clutch holds better. These are the center points. You see springs to make them stay still, and they are also in the upper plate. So the spring must remain in place, and the main difference between the two models is that the single spring in the center raises the plate and compresses the discs, except that the spring does not press uniformly, but can press more on one side than on the other. So it makes half a clutch work more than the other half, and in the end the seal gets worse. Whereas here the 6 springs exert a much better distributed pressure, because each spring pushes on its sector, so in the end the load is much better distributed. But there is another difference, perhaps just as important. After the sped up assembly and disassembly, here we are. Let's see from a theoretical point of view why the clutch with a larger friction surface with the same spring load resists a lower torque than the one with a smaller friction surface. We already discussed this topic on the occasion of the large clutches, but it's a question on which is good to insist on, because we often hear completely wrong ideas about these connections being expressed. Now, let's leave aside for a moment the difference in the spring load between the old one, which by the way holds less, and the new one. But let's focus on the comparison between the different conformation of the circular crowns. That is, with the same external diameter, the narrower circular crown with the same spring load is able to withstand a greater torque. This is for what reason? Because the average diameter is greater. and therefore the lever with which the clutch is able to work, because the spring load, I will call it in the singular for simplicity. In short, the spring load is exerted and distributed on the friction surface, replicating itself disc by disc. So, clarification. Each disc is loaded the same way, one on top of the other. They all load the same way. So let's take into consideration a single disc, and we distribute the spring load per square millimeter on the surface of the disc, on the friction surface. Then, the disc that has a wider circular ring with the same external diameter will see a lower load per square millimeter than the disc that has a narrower circular ring. So, a part of the load will necessarily be transferred to the innermost part, which has a more disadvantageous lever arm. Therefore, overall, the transmissible torque decreases. However, this is not the only point, because otherwise it'd be worthwhile to make friction that causes friction on a very narrow circular ring. Unfortunately, there is another matter. That one thing is the transmissible torque with the clutch attached. Another thing is the heat that can be dissipated when the friction is sliding. Therefore, the advantage of the clutch, characterized by a wider circular crown, is manifested during sliding, because with the same skidding and with the same load during skating, it will heat up less, because the heat will be distributed over a greater surface and therefore over a greater mass. This is the difference. So you have to find a balance, and that's why you multiply discs, especially in motorcycle clutches, but you keep on tight circular crowns for this very reason. So an improvement that they try to make to the old clutches with an aftermarket kit, here it is, of the double spring, was precisely that that it replaced the single spring with a double spring. The double spring has a slightly higher load, but the biggest difference is in the fact that having two springs, among other things, they have the coils in the opposite direction to the other. They can be placed in such a way that as to better distribute the load on the friction surface of the discs. Now, we stop here in the sense that we limit ourselves to this discussion of these two Piaggio clutches, also because there are many on the market and they all work more or less the same way, except in those few cases that look more like those of the motorcycles, which have adjustable springs. That is, they can be mounted from the outside. In short, without the need to do this assembly here. There are some of the many special aftermarket clutches, even some very expensive ones now, which are made of from an HP basis and some on a special basis. The difference concerns the discourse made before on the different friction surface. Therefore, on a special base, there is a greater friction surface, and therefore a clutch that will resist when attached at the same spring load at a slightly lower torque. But we tolerate better. It will tolerate better skating. On an HP basis, we'll have a clutch that will need less spring load to hold the same torque as the other, but it will be more vulnerable to skidding. So it will tend to heat up a little more. So what clutch do you have, or which one do you prefer? Write to us in the comment and let us know. If you liked this video, leave a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Remember, White One Racing is not a workshop, but an amateur sport association that works on engines only for sport purposes and only for its associates.